Each sweep was a battle against time and the elements, the slippery moss, the cobwebs, the dust of ages. But as the broom of branches revealed what lay beneath, an unusual gleam began to emerge. It was not the rough stone they expected, but a pattern, a color. With each leaf removed, the faint firelight danced over something that seemed unreal. The chapel floor, hidden under centuries of debris and oblivion, was a dazzling mosaic, a carpet of shimmering rubies and deep emeralds, inlaid in intricate designs. The historical reward, the forgotten legend his grandfather had always told, was there, beneath their feet, a treasure that would change their lives forever and silence those who once scorned them. Time stopped for Manuel. His eyes, already blurred by age and the unshed tears of a life of deprivation, widened, trying to process the vision the branch broom had unveiled. It was not a dream, nor the fever that sometimes assailed him on cold nights. There, under the trembling light of the fire he had lit with such sacrifice, the chapel floor pulsed with a life of its own, a heart of stone and light. Rubies, red as the blood he thought he had shed in vain for an entire existence. Emeralds, green as the hope that had long abandoned him. They formed intricate patterns, spirals and geometries that seemed to tell a story, a forgotten language etched into the very ground. Manuel knelt with difficulty, the pain in his knees ignored by the vertigo of discovery. His wrinkled hand reached out, hesitant, and touched the cold, hard surface. It was not glass nor a trick of light. It was real. The roughness of the cut stones, the mineral coldness that radiated, the density beneath his fingers. Centuries of dust and oblivion had not been able to erase the brilliance that now, with the removal of the layer of debris, erupted with an almost violent force. The legend, the old story his grandfather, a man with dreamy eyes and calloused hands, used to tell on winter nights by the flickering light of a candle. It spoke of a hidden treasure, a secret guarded by the monks of a forgotten monastery, built over the tombs of ancient kings. Manuel, still a boy, listened with the fascination of innocence, but adult life, harsh and relentless, had turned the legend into a fairy tale, a comfort for the poor and hopeless. Now the legend was not just true, it was a tangible reality shimmering beneath his hands. A dry, hoarse laugh escaped his lips, mixed with a sob. It was the laugh of one who finally sees justice, but also the cry of one who realizes the crushing weight of such a revelation. His entire life, marked by poverty, by loss, by the contempt of those who saw him as a nuisance, a useless old man, paraded before his eyes. The humiliations, the closed doors, the hunger, the loneliness after the departure of his beloved wife. All of it now seemed a cruel preface to this moment. That treasure was not just wealth, it was vindication. It was proof that he, Manuel, the old widower and poor man, was not a fool for believing in the whispers of the past. But the joy was fleeting, quickly replaced by a wave of dread. The brilliance of the jewels seemed to amplify the silence of the chapel, making it heavy, oppressive. The monastery, once a refuge of peace and oblivion, had transformed into an open-air vault, a magnet for unimaginable dangers. He was alone, completely alone. A fragile old man in a remote place with a fortune that defied comprehension. Who would protect him? Who would help him guard this secret? Or worse, who would come to take it? The fire crackled, its flames dancing and casting grotesque shadows on the damp walls. Each shadow seemed to come alive. Each creak of the wind in the cracks of the ruins sounded like approaching footsteps. The cold night air, once a mere nuisance, now seemed to carry a premonition, a warning. Manuel looked around, his eyes scanning the dark walls, the empty niches, the moss-covered tombs he knew lay beneath the floor, beneath the leaves, beneath the rubies and emeralds. He was treading on centuries of history, on secrets that might have cost lives to keep. What to do? How to react to something so grand and dangerous? Flee with a single stone? Impossible. The mosaic was vast, a carpet covering most of the chapel floor. Unearthing it would be a Herculean task, and where would he take such wealth? The world outside, from which he had fled, was cruel and corrupt. This treasure, if discovered, would bring not only fortune but an avalanche of problems, of greed, of violence. Manuel recoiled, feeling his heart pound in his chest. The beauty of the mosaic, once mesmerizing, now seemed threatening. Those precious stones, so cold and indifferent, were a greater burden than any poverty he had ever known. The night was long, and sleep, which he so craved, now seemed a betrayal, a vulnerability he could not afford. He needed to think. He needed to protect himself. The monastery, his refuge, had become his prison, and the ground beneath his feet, his bed of rubies and emeralds, was now a minefield of hope and despair. Manuel's breath was a hoarse groan in the sepulchral silence of the chapel. His heart, an erratic drum, seemed to want to leap from his chest. The vertigo of discovery, once a wave of euphoria, now transformed into a tidal wave of dread. The jewels, which had recently sparkled with the promise of a redeemed life, now seemed like cold, watchful eyes, observing him from each cut facet. What was a treasure had turned into an unbearable burden, a curse that he, in his innocence, had unearthed. He dragged himself away from the mosaic, his body trembling, no longer from the cold, but from a visceral fear that chilled him to the bone. Every ruby, every emerald, was a silent scream of danger. The monastery, once a sanctuary of oblivion, was now a stage for an imminent tragedy. He was there, a fragile old man, invisible to the world, but suddenly the guardian of a fortune that could bring down kingdoms. The irony was cruel, almost unbearable. The fire, his only companion and source of warmth, seemed to diminish, its flames dancing with a nervous energy, casting elongated, distorted shadows on the stone walls. Each shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, transforming into menacing figures, lurking in the dark corners. The wind howled through the cracks in the ruins, and each gust sounded like a whisper, a step, a presence that wasn't there before. Paranoia, an unwelcome companion, tightened its icy embrace around him. He needed to hide everything again. Manuel's mind, clouded by age and shock, desperately tried to formulate a plan, any plan. He looked at the branch broom, the tool that had revealed the secret. Could he simply sweep the leaves and dust back, cover the shine, pretend nothing had happened? With a painful effort, he stood up, his knees cracking in protest. He picked up the broom and, with trembling hands, began to push the dry leaves and moss back over the mosaic. It was a futile task. The leaves were few, thin, incapable of hiding the intense brilliance radiating from the stones. Even under the thin layer of debris, the red of the rubies and the green of the emeralds seemed to pierce the darkness, a light of their own that defied concealment. It was like trying to hide the sun with a sheet. Frustration and despair overwhelmed him. What to do? Flee? Where to? With what? He couldn't take a single stone without disfiguring the mosaic. And even if he could, how would he explain possession of such wealth? The world outside, from which he had fled, was a place of distrust and greed. He would be robbed, perhaps killed, before he could even exchange a single gem. His gaze fixed on the tombs, the stone slabs he knew lay beneath the floor, beneath the leaves, beneath the rubies and emeralds. The ancient kings, the monks who had guarded this secret for centuries, had they died to protect it? Or had they been buried over it so that their presence would serve as a warning, an eternal guardian? Manuel felt a shiver run down his spine. He was not just treading on a treasure, but on a legacy, on a silent pact with the dead. The night seemed to stretch into a cold, dark eternity. Sleep, once a welcome refuge, was now a luxury he could not afford. Every external noise, every creak of wood, Every whisper of the wind was a warning sign. He sat near the fire, hugging his knees, his eyes fixed on the semi-covered mosaic. His mind raced, searching for solutions but finding only dead ends. He needed time to think, to understand the magnitude of what he had found. But time was an enemy now. With each passing minute, with each shadow that moved, the threat seemed to grow, invisible, yet palpable. The solitude of the chapel, once comforting, was now a trap. He was alone, yes, but not unaccompanied. The eyes of the jewels, the weight of history, and the imminent shadow of danger were his new and terrible companions. A thought occurred to him, cold and sharp as a blade. What if someone already knew? What if the legend, which he considered a fairy tale, was known by others, more ambitious and less scrupulous? What if his arrival at the monastery had been observed? The idea made his stomach churn. He had fled the city, misery, humiliation. But perhaps he had fled into a much larger trap, one that he himself, with his branch broom, had activated. He needed a plan to survive the night, a plan to protect the treasure or himself from it. But his mind was exhausted, overwhelmed. The only certainty was that from that moment on, his life, which he thought was at an end, had been turned upside down in a way he never could have imagined. Old Manuel, the poor and forgotten widower, had died in the sweeping of that floor, and a new man, haunted by wealth and fear, had been born. And the night, oh, the night was just the beginning. He could not sleep. Not with the glow of those stones piercing the darkness, calling for attention, for greed, for blood. He needed to keep watch. The night was a heavy, damp cloak, and the silence of the chapel, once a balm for Manuel's tired soul, had now transformed into a deafening echo of his own fears. The glow of the jewels, even under the thin layer of leaves he had tried, in vain. To push back was an open wound in the darkness, a promise of danger that pulsed with a life of its own. He could not sleep. Every nerve in his aged body was on high alert, his bloodshot eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for something, anything, that could confirm or deny his worst premonitions. The warmth of the fire was an illusion, unable to ward off the cold that crept up his spine. It was not the cold of the night, but the ice of dread, of crushing loneliness in the face of a fortune he had never asked for, and which now seemed like a curse. He, Manuel, the man who had fled life to die in peace, had stumbled upon a secret that could cost him his very life. The irony was cruel, biting. Poverty had made him invisible. Wealth, now, made him a target. His mind, a labyrinth of confused and desperate thoughts, revolved around the same question: what to do? Flee? Where to? With what? The mosaic was vast, a shimmering river of precious stones that stretched across much of the chapel floor. To tear out a single gem would be sacrilege, a profanation of that ancient place, and even if he did, how would he explain possession of a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg? The world outside, the world that had spat him out, would not accept such a miracle. He would be a thief, a madman, an old liar. The tombs beneath the floor, beneath the leaves, beneath the rubies and emeralds, seemed to weigh upon him. The ancient kings, the monks who had guarded this secret with their lives, perhaps with their eternal silences. They had sealed this treasure with death, and now Manuel, an intruder, had broken that seal. He was not just treading on wealth, but on a pact, on a centuries-old oath. He felt the presence of the dead, not as ghosts, but as silent witnesses to his terrible discovery, their invisible eyes fixed on him, judging him. A crack. Manuel's heart leaped into his throat. Was it the wind, a dry branch falling, or a step? He held his breath, his muscles tense, his body huddled by the fire. The sound did not repeat, only the distant howl of the wind, which seemed to whisper forgotten names through the ruins. Paranoia was a dense fog, distorting reality, transforming every shadow into a lurking figure, every creak of wood into a warning. He needed to protect himself. But how? The chapel had no doors, only empty arches that opened into the darkness of the night. He was a tiny point of vulnerability in a vast ocean of danger. His eyes fell on the branch broom, the tool that had unearthed his ruin. Useless. He needed something more substantial. With a hoarse groan, Manuel stood up again, his body protesting with every movement. He dragged himself to one of the arches, fumbling at the cold stone walls. There was nothing to block, nothing to close. The monastery was an open wound, exposed to whatever the night might bring. He returned to the fire, his mind in tatters. The only thing he could do was watch and wait. But wait for what? For morning, which would bring light, but also the possibility of curious eyes, or for darkness, which could hide predators. A chilling thought pierced his exhausted mind. What if the legend, which he considered a fairy tale, was known by others, not just by his grandfather, but by unscrupulous men who had searched for this place, for this treasure, for generations? What if his arrival at the monastery, his flight from the city, had been observed? He had hidden, yes, but perhaps he had been guided, unknowingly, into a much larger trap, one that he himself, with his branch broom, had activated. Cold sweat trickled down his wrinkled forehead. He had fled misery, humiliation, the slow death of the soul. But perhaps he had fled to a quicker, more violent death. The gleam of the jewels, once a beacon of hope, was now a torch that marked him, a shimmering target in the darkness. Suddenly, a distinct sound. It was not the wind. It was not a branch. It was a dragging of something heavy, coming from outside, from the direction of the path leading to the monastery. Manuel froze, his heart pounding uncontrollably against his ribs. He crouched down further, trying to merge with the shadows, his gaze fixed on the arch from which the sound seemed to come. The dragging stopped. An even denser silence followed, a silence laden with expectation, with threat. He was not alone. The night, which he feared, had finally brought company. And Manuel knew, with a cold and terrible certainty, that this company did not come in peace. The air in the chapel grew dense, heavy, every particle of dust suspended in the flickering firelight seeming to vibrate with tension. Manuel did not breathe. His lungs burned, but fear was a cruel master, paralyzing him. The dragging had stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than any noise, a deafening pause before the storm. It was the silence of the hunt, the moment the prey knows it has been detected but has not yet seen the predator. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on the arch from which the sound had come. The darkness outside was an abyss, but he knew that something, or someone, was lurking, just beyond the reach of the faint firelight. Cold sweat trickled down his wrinkled forehead, mixing with soot and dirt. Manuel's heart beat like a war drum in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, threatening to betray his presence. He crouched down further, desperately trying to merge with the shadows cast by the ruined columns, becoming an extension of the cold stone and moss. Then a shadow. It was not the dancing shadow of the fire, nor the illusion created by the wind. It was a form, tall, slender, silhouetted against the darkness outside, filling the arch like a frame for a nightmare. The figure hesitated at the entrance, as if assessing the environment, the glow of the fire, the ghostly light emanating from the floor. Manuel felt a shiver run down his spine. The figure seemed to observe, calculate, and Manuel was the cornered rat, awaiting the final blow. A step, slow, deliberate, the sound of a heavy boot scraping stone. Then another. The intruder was inside. Manuel could feel the presence, the air around him seeming to grow colder, denser. The figure moved with a strange fluidity, almost silently, despite its apparent weight. Its eyes swept the chapel, and Manuel was certain he was being sought. Not just the monastery, but him, or perhaps what he had found. The firelight was a traitor, revealing the intruder's outline. Manuel could not distinguish features, but the silhouette was imposing, menacing. What was that dragging sound? What was the intruder carrying? Manuel's mind, already on the verge of collapse, desperately tried to find an answer, but found only more questions, more dread. The intruder stopped. Its eyes, Manuel was sure, were fixed on the floor, on the mosaic. Even under the thin layer of leaves and dust that Manuel had tried, in vain, to use as a disguise, the gleam of the rubies and emeralds was undeniable. It was a beacon, an invitation to greed, a promise of danger. The figure leaned slightly, as if to examine more closely, and Manuel felt his blood run cold. They knew. They came for it. A low, guttural sound escaped the intruder's lips. It was not a word, but a murmur of astonishment, or perhaps recognition. The figure moved again, this time towards the center of the chapel, towards the mosaic. Each step was an eternity for Manuel, each movement of the intruder a stab in his heart. He could smell damp earth and something else, something metallic and pungent, which he could not identify. The intruder was now a few feet from the mosaic, the firelight partially illuminating its back. Manuel could see that it carried something in its hands, something long and thin, which it held firmly. It was not a broom. It was something more sinister. The figure knelt, and Manuel caught a glimpse of a dark hood, of worn but sturdy clothes. The intruder extended a gloved hand, pushing aside the few leaves Manuel had scattered, revealing more of the shimmering brilliance of the stones. An audible gasp, this time clearer, deeper. It was a gasp of triumph, of a search that had finally come to an end. Manuel felt a knot in his throat. He had been the catalyst, the old fool who had revealed the secret others had sought for centuries. He was a pawn, a tool. The figure stood up, turning slowly, and its eyes, or what Manuel imagined were its eyes in the darkness beneath the hood, swept the chapel again. This time the search seemed more intentional, more focused. They were not just looking for the treasure, they were looking for who had found it. Manuel crouched down further, his body trembling uncontrollably. He was old, weak, invisible. But the gleam of the jewels, the warmth of the fire, and the sound of his own heart screaming in his ears made him a target. He was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. Death, which he had tried to avoid by fleeing to this forgotten place, had finally reached him, brought by the brilliance of 1,000 rubies and emeralds. The intruder took another step, this time towards the fire, and Manuel saw the gleam of metal in the figure's hand. It was not a tool, it was a weapon, a long, sharp blade, reflecting the firelight with a sinister glow. The dragging, the metallic sound, that pungent smell, it all made sense now. The company did not come in peace. It came to claim what had been found, and to silence whoever had discovered it. The night was just the beginning, yes, but for Manuel it seemed to be the end. The gleam of the blade was a stolen moonbeam, dancing in the darkness, a chilling omen that pierced Manuel's soul. The hooded figure, now closer, was no longer an indistinct shadow, but a palpable presence, a herald of death that moved with the cold precision of a predator. Manuel felt the air thin in his lungs, each beat of his heart a drum, rolling out his own sentence. He was an old man, a forgotten widower, and the end, which he thought he had postponed by fleeing to this ruined refuge, now arrived, not in silence, but with the metallic whisper of a blade. The intruder stopped a few feet from the fire, the flickering light casting grotesque shadows that danced in the chapel, transforming the columns into ghosts and the walls into ramparts of despair. Manuel, huddled, almost invisible in the gloom, watched every movement. The blade, long and sharp, seemed a natural extension of the stranger's arm. It was not a working tool, but an instrument of death, polished by intent. The smell of damp earth and metal, once just an impression, was now strong, almost suffocating. A heavy silence settled, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the deafening sound of blood pulsing in Manuel's veins. The intruder did not speak, made no sound, just stood there, imposing, head slightly tilted, as if listening, or perhaps assessing. Manuel felt the invisible eyes beneath the hood sweep the chapel, lingering on the jewel mosaic, then on the fire, and finally, he was sure, on his hiding place. It was the calm before the storm, the calculated pause of a hunter enjoying the terror of his prey. The intruder's gloved hand, holding the blade, moved slightly, not in attack, but in a gesture that seemed almost contemplative. Then the figure knelt again, not to examine the jewels, but to pick something up from the ground, something Manuel had not noticed before. It was a piece of dark cloth, perhaps a bag, which the intruder opened with a swift movement. The sound of fabric rubbing fabric was amplified by the silence, sounding like a violent tear. Manuel held his breath. What would it do? Collect the jewels and leave? Or silence him first? Manuel's mind spun in a whirlwind of panic and resignation. He had dreamed of a peaceful end, with the dignity life had denied him. But fate, with its cruel humor, had reserved for him a stage of rubies and emeralds and a violent death at the hands of a stranger. The hooded figure extended its free hand to the mosaic, and Manuel saw the gleam of a walnut-sized ruby picked up with ease. The sound of the stone rubbing against the fabric of the bag was almost inaudible, but to Manuel, it sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell. The intruder did not just take one. With surprising dexterity, the gloved hand swept the floor, collecting the stones with terrifying speed. Rubies and emeralds, centuries of secret and wealth, disappeared into the dark bag as if they were grains of sand. With each jewel that vanished, Manuel felt a piece of his own hope drain away. Not that he could have used that wealth, but its mere existence. The miracle of its discovery had been a brief glimpse of something beyond his misery. Now, even that was being stolen, and he, the discoverer, would be just a silenced witness. The intruder stopped collecting the stones. The bag, now visibly heavier, was tied and tucked under the garments. The figure stood up, and Manuel felt the invisible gaze beneath the hood fix on him again. There was no doubt. He had been seen. He had been detected. The hunt was over, and the predator was ready for the final blow. The blade in the intruder's hand rose slightly, its sharp tip pointing to the ruined sky. Manuel closed his eyes for an instant, his body trembling uncontrollably. He thought of his wife, of his simple, hard life, of the few joys he had had. He did not want to die like this, like a cornered animal, without a lament, without a goodbye. But the blow did not come. Instead, a sound. Not a shout, not a threat, but a low hiss, almost a whistle that seemed to come from outside the chapel, from the darkness surrounding the monastery. The intruder froze, the blade still raised. Its head turned slightly towards the arch from which the sound had come. It was a sound of warning, a call. Manuel opened his eyes, a sliver of hope, faint as the firelight igniting in his chest. Was there more than one? Was the intruder not alone? Panic gave way to a new wave of terror. If there were more, what did that mean? More danger? Or perhaps, just perhaps, a distraction? The hooded figure hesitated for a moment, the blade lowering slightly. The hiss repeated, this time more urgent, closer. The intruder cast a last glance at Manuel, a look the old man felt like a cold touch of ice, a promise of return. Then, with surprising agility for someone carrying a bag of jewels and a blade, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness of the arch, moving with the same silent fluidity with which it had arrived. The sound of hurried footsteps, almost inaudible, quickly faded. Manuel remained there, paralyzed, his heart still pounding erratically, his body sweaty and trembling. Silence returned, But it was a different silence, laden not with imminent threat, but with a lingering terror of a narrow escape. He was alone again, but the solitude now was a prison, not a refuge. The mosaic, once a beacon of hope, was now an open wound on the floor, a reminder of what had been stolen and of the danger that still lurked. The night was not over. Only the first part of the nightmare. The silence that followed the intruder's departure was not a relief, but a new layer of terror, denser and more suffocating than the presence of the blade. Manuel remained huddled, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, his heart still racing like an uncontrolled war drum in his chest. The air seemed to have been sucked from his lungs, and he struggled to breathe, inhaling the smell of damp earth, smoke, and the metallic residue the intruder had left behind. He was alone, yes, but the solitude now was a sentence, not a refuge. The chapel, once a sanctuary of peace and oblivion, had transformed into a trap, a stage where he had witnessed the violation of a millennia-old secret and, barely, had not become another silent victim. The glow of the fire, which once warmed and guided him, now seemed a treacherous beacon, drawing attention to what remained of the mosaic, and, consequently, to him. Slowly, with the caution of a wounded animal, Manuel opened his eyes. The chapel was empty, but the darkness seemed deeper, more menacing. The arch through which the intruder had disappeared was a portal to the unknown, an abyss of shadows and dangers. The hiss, that low and urgent sound, echoed in his mind, irrefutable proof that the intruder was not alone. There were more of them, a company, and if one part of the group had come to steal, what would the other part be doing, looking for him? The mosaic, once a breathtaking sight, was now an open wound on the floor. The stones that had been torn out left dark holes, like empty eyes staring at him. The wealth, which for a brief moment had promised an escape from misery, had become the catalyst of his nightmare. He had been a fool, a naive old man who, by sweeping the floor to find a place to sleep, had unearthed not a treasure, but a curse. The cold of the night began to penetrate his thin clothes, but the cold sweat that covered his body was more intense. He needed to move, but where? Leaving the chapel meant venturing into the darkness, where the others might be. Staying meant waiting for their return, or being discovered by whoever was out there. The fire, once his ally, was dying, its flames diminishing, transforming the dancing shadows into static, menacing figures. Manuel tried to stand up, but his legs trembled uncontrollably. Age, hunger, and terror had taken their toll. He dragged himself, using his hands for support, to the nearest wall, seeking the comfort of the cold stone against his back. Every movement was torture. Every noise he made seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. He could hear the wind howling softly through the ruins of the monastery, a ghostly lament that seemed to carry whispers of danger. What would they do now? They had taken part of the jewels, but not all. The mosaic still shone, an invitation to more greed, and he, Manuel, was the only living witness. Why hadn't they silenced him? The question hammered in his mind, a pang of hope mixed with an even greater terror. Perhaps the interruption had been so sudden that there was no time. Or perhaps, and this idea was the most terrifying of all, they had a different plan for him. He remembered the pungent smell of metal, the dragging. It wasn't just the blade. There was something else, something he couldn't identify in the darkness, but which now, in his feverish mind, took on monstrous forms. The monastery, built over graves, now seemed like a living mausoleum, and he, Manuel, was the next to be buried. The fire gave a final crackle, and a spark rose towards the ruined ceiling before dying out. The light diminished even further, plunging the chapel into almost total gloom. The glow of the remaining jewels in the mosaic seemed weaker, more distant, like dying stars in a dark sky. Manuel felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't wait. He needed a plan, however desperate. The only way out was the same one the intruder had used to enter and exit. But what awaited him out there? More intruders? Absolute darkness? Death? He didn't know, but the prospect of standing still, waiting for the inevitable, was even more terrifying. With a Herculean effort, Manuel pushed himself up, leaning against the cold wall. His knees ached, his head spun, but adrenaline still coursed through his veins, a last surge of survival. He needed to move, to hide, perhaps to try to find a way out of that cursed place. The monastery, which he had sought as a refuge, had become his personal hell, a labyrinth of shadows and danger, where wealth and death danced a macabre waltz. He took a hesitant step towards the arch, his eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound of the wind sounded like approaching footsteps. He was an old and weak man, but the will to live, even for one more day, was a stubborn fire that refused to be extinguished. He would not die there, not like a cornered rat. If he had to face his destiny, he would do so in motion, fighting against the darkness, against greed, against the death that pursued him. The night was far from over, and for Manuel, every second was an eternity of terror and uncertainty. Manuel's decision was not one of courage, but of desperation. To stay there, huddled in the chapel, was to wait for death. To move, however terrifying the darkness outside, offered a chance, however small. With a muffled groan, he pushed himself away from the cold wall, his body protesting with every fiber. His knees, fragile and aching, threatened to give way. His head spun, hunger and terror forming a dense fog in his mind, but the image of the blade, the cold gleam of metal, was a goad that propelled him forward. He dragged himself more than walked towards the arch through which the intruder had disappeared. Each step was an eternity, every sound he made, the scrape of his feet over dry leaves and earth, the rustle of his clothes, the erratic beat of his own heart, seemed like thunder in the oppressive silence of the night. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of the chapel, desperately tried to penetrate the absolute darkness that stretched beyond the threshold. As he passed through the arch, the air grew colder, denser, laden with the smell of ancient stone, moss, and damp earth. The chapel, with its dying fire, now seemed a distant safe harbor, a fleeting memory of a security that never truly existed. He was in the central courtyard of the monastery, a labyrinth of crumbling walls, broken pillars, and ghostly arches that rose against the night sky, dotted with a few indifferent stars. The leaves, which had previously covered the chapel floor, were here a thicker carpet, hiding traps and holes. Manuel crouched, trying to merge with the shadows of a broken pillar. The hiss, that low and urgent sound, echoed in his mind, irrefutable proof that the intruder was not alone. There were more of them. A company. And if one part of the group had come to steal, what would the other part be doing, looking for him? The idea made him tremble uncontrollably. He could hear the wind howling softly through the ruins of the monastery, a ghostly lament that seemed to carry whispers of danger. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound of the wind sounded like approaching footsteps. His ears were strained, trying to discern any sound that was not his own. Silence was an illusion, a veil that hid invisible threats. The chapel fire, now a mere orange dying point behind him, no longer offered comfort, only a treacherous beacon that could reveal his position. He needed to move away, to hide, to find a deeper, darker refuge. But where? The monastery was a tangle of ruins, each door, each corridor, an invitation to the unknown, to danger. He dragged himself along the wall, his rough hands fumbling at the cold, damp stone, searching for any opening, any recess that could offer shelter. His eyes, now a little more adapted to the darkness, began to distinguish the ghostly shapes of the twisted trees that had grown within the monastery walls, their bare canopies scratching the sky. Suddenly, a sound, not the wind, not the rustle of leaves, a distant metallic sound, like the scraping of one stone against another, or perhaps the friction of a tool. It came from the opposite direction of the chapel, further into the monastery. Manuel's heart gave a painful leap. They were there, the others. What were they doing? Looking for more jewels? Or perhaps, and this idea was the most terrifying of all, setting a trap. He froze, pressing himself against the wall, trying to become invisible. The sound repeated, clearer now, a slow, methodical rhythm. It was not the sound of someone searching, but of someone working or digging. Manuel's mind, already in tatters, desperately tried to process the information. If they were digging, what were they looking for? More secrets, or perhaps what the intruder had left behind? The cold of the night intensified, but the cold sweat that covered his body was more intense. He could not go in that direction. He needed to find another way. His eyes swept the darkness, looking for an exit, a glimmer of hope. There was a door, or what remained of it, further along the wall, almost swallowed by ivy and bushes. It was a narrow, dark passage, promising only more darkness, but also the possibility of moving away from the menacing sound. With a Herculean effort, Manuel pushed himself forward, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He had no more strength, but adrenaline, the pure and primitive instinct of survival, was a relentless engine. He dragged himself towards the door, with each step feeling the invisible presence of the intruders, the smell of danger in the air. The monastery, which he had sought as a refuge, had become his personal hell, a labyrinth of shadows and danger where wealth and death danced a macabre waltz. He would not die there, not like a cornered rat. If he had to face his destiny, he would do so in motion, fighting against the darkness, against greed, against the death that pursued him. The night was far from over, and for Manuel, every second was an eternity of terror and uncertainty. The door, or what remained of it, was more of a crack in the stone wall, almost swallowed by ivy and thorny bushes clinging to the damp stone. Manuel dragged himself towards it, every fiber of his body protesting in agony. His knees, already raw, scraped on the uneven ground. His hands fumbled at the cold, rough stone, seeking support. The smell of moss and damp earth was strong there, mixed with an older, almost forgotten odor of stone and dust. The metallic sound, the slow, methodical rhythm of a tool working, seemed to intensify with each beat of his heart. A macabre drum dictating the pace of his despair. He reached the opening, his body trembling uncontrollably. The darkness that stretched beyond was absolute, denser than anything he had ever experienced. There wasn't even the dying glow of the chapel fire to guide his eyes. It was a void that promised only the unknown, perhaps death itself. But the alternative, remaining in the courtyard, exposed, at the mercy of the intruders, was even more terrifying. With a muffled groan, Manuel forced his body through the narrow passage, feeling the ivy scratch his skin and clothes. The air on the other side was different, colder, heavier, laden with the pungent smell of mold, damp earth, and something else, something he couldn't identify, but which evoked images of decomposition and oblivion. His feet sank into a thicker layer of dry leaves and debris, and he felt the ground slope slightly downwards. It was a corridor, narrow and low, the stone walls so close he could touch them with both outstretched hands. The darkness was so total that, for a moment, Manuel thought he was blind. He stretched his hands forward, fumbling in the void, feeling cobwebs on his face. The damp cold of the stone, the sound of the tool, though muffled by the thick walls, could still be heard, a distant echo reminding him of the constant presence of danger. He was moving away, but not enough. He needed more, a deeper, safer refuge. Manuel's mind, already in tatters, struggled to process the situation. What were they doing? Digging for what? More jewels? Or perhaps... And this idea chilled him to the bone, looking for him. He dragged himself step by step down what seemed to be a gentle slope. The corridor was a tunnel of terror, each step a gamble in the dark. The walls seemed to close in on him. The darkness was a physical, suffocating presence. He could feel his own warm breath in the cold air, the erratic beat of his heart echoing in his ears. Suddenly, his feet touched something different. It wasn't earth nor leaves. It was a smooth, cold surface polished by time. He knelt, fumbling in the dark. It was stone, but not the rough stone of the walls. It was a slab, large and cold, and there were more of them forming a floor. A shiver ran down his spine. Slabs. He was in a place where the floor was made of slabs. The monastery, built over graves. The realization hit him with the force of a punch. He had dragged himself into a crypt, or perhaps catacombs. He was surrounded by the dead. The irony was cruel. He had fled death in the courtyard to hide among the dead. The smell of earth and mold intensified, now mixed with a more subtle, metallic, almost rusty odor, which seemed to come from the stone itself. Manuel crouched, trying to shrink even further, wishing he could disappear. The chapel fire, now a distant memory, seemed a dream of warmth and safety that never existed. He was alone, in the dark, surrounded by ghosts and the imminent threat of the living. He dragged himself to the side of the corridor, trying to find a niche, a recess, any place where he could hide. His hands touched a wall that felt colder, smoother. It was a structure, a kind of altar or side tomb. He squeezed himself behind it, his body trembling so much his teeth chattered. The silence there was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the tool and by his own pounding heart. Why hadn't they silenced him? The question hammered in his mind, a pang of hope mixed with an even greater terror. Perhaps the interruption had been so sudden that there was no time. Or perhaps, and this idea was the most terrifying of all, they had a different plan for him. He was a witness, a living witness to a treasure that had been hidden for centuries and now rediscovered and stolen. As he huddled in the darkness, his eyes, now a little more adapted, began to distinguish ghostly shapes. They were not the dead, but the shadows of the crypt structures, the recesses in the walls, the slabs that formed the floor, and perhaps the niches where bodies had been laid. The air was so heavy it seemed difficult to breathe. Suddenly, a new sound, closer, clearer. It was not the metallic sound of the tool. It was a dragging, a rustle of leaves and earth, coming from the direction he had come, from the courtyard. Someone was moving. Someone was coming into the corridor. Manuel's heart gave a painful leap, almost stopping. They had followed him. Or perhaps they were just exploring. It didn't matter. He was cornered. The crypt, which he had sought as a refuge, had become his final trap. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to merge with the darkness, praying that he would be invisible, inaudible, that death, which he had narrowly avoided, would not find him there among the forgotten dead. The night was far from over, and for Manuel, every second was an eternity of terror and uncertainty. The dragging of leaves and earth grew more distinct, closer, a sound that chilled Manuel's blood. It was not the wind, nor the random rustle of the night. It was an intentional, heavy movement, and coming from the narrow tunnel he had crawled through. Manuel's heart beat erratically, a frantic drum in his chest, echoing in the suffocating darkness of the crypt. He crouched down further behind the stone structure, which now revealed itself as an ancient sarcophagus, its cold, damp surface against his back. The smell of mold and damp earth mingled with the metallic, almost rusty odor that seemed to emanate from the slabs themselves. Then a sliver of light, faint, flickering but unmistakable, a lantern, or perhaps a torch, casting dancing shadows on the corridor walls. The light approached, revealing the distorted silhouette of one figure, then another. Two people. Manuel squeezed his eyes shut, trying to merge with the darkness, wishing to be invisible, inaudible. The voices, muffled at first, grew clearer as they approached. They were harsh whispers, laden with impatience and frustration. "He can't have gone far," said a deep, hoarse voice, which Manuel vaguely recognized as that of the man who had pushed him. "The old man is injured, can barely walk. He must be here somewhere." "What if he fell into a crack, or hid so well we can't find him?" replied the other voice, higher pitched with a mocking tone. "He's a rat, and rats hide in holes." The lantern light swept the corridor, dancing over the floor slabs, over the stone walls filled with empty niches. Manuel held his breath, his body rigid, every muscle tense. He could feel the warmth of the light on his face, even through the crack where he was hidden. The footsteps stopped a few feet from his hiding place. He could hear the men's heavy breathing, the rustle of their clothes. He saw what he shouldn't have, the grave voice continued. "And we can't let him tell anyone. The treasure, it's ours, only ours." Manuel felt a shiver run down his spine. The treasure. They were talking about the mosaic of rubies and emeralds. They knew, and they knew he knew. The chapel fire, the frantic search, the metallic sound of digging, it all fit. They weren't just looking for random jewels. They were after what he had discovered, and they were willing to do anything to keep it a secret. The lantern light moved, illuminating the top of the sarcophagus behind which Manuel was hidden. For a terrifying instant, he thought he would be discovered. His eyes narrowed, waiting for the shout, the attack, but the light moved away, sweeping the opposite side of the corridor. "There's nothing here," said the high-pitched voice, with a sigh of frustration. "Just bones and dust. The old man wouldn't be here. He's afraid of the dead, like all cowards." "Don't underestimate a desperate man," the grave voice retorted. "He could have crawled anywhere. This monastery is a labyrinth of secrets. What if he found another way? An exit?" Manuel heard the sound of something being dragged on the floor, a heavy noise. Perhaps a foot or some tool they were carrying. The smell of earth and sweat from the men filled the air, mingling with the crypt's mold. He could feel their presence, almost touch their shadows. "Let's check further ahead," said the grave voice. "We can't leave any stone unturned. The boss wants the old man, and he wants what he saw. What if he hid something?" The lantern light began to recede, the shadows lengthening and distorting again. The footsteps grew more distant, the whispers more muffled, until the metallic sound of the tool, which had previously seemed a distant echo from the courtyard, now seemed to come from further down the corridor, where the men were heading. They were moving deeper into the crypt, into the depths of the monastery. Manuel exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a trembling, painful sigh. His entire body shook uncontrollably, a chill that wasn't just from the crypt's cold. He had escaped by a hair's breadth, but for how long? They were determined. They knew what he had found, and they wouldn't stop until they found him, or what he had seen. Darkness swallowed him again, denser and more oppressive than before, now that the memory of the flickering light still lingered in his mind. He was alone again, but solitude no longer brought comfort, only the certainty that danger lurked, closer than ever. The crypt, which had seemed a temporary refuge, now revealed itself as an endless tunnel, a labyrinth of stone and death, where every step could lead him closer to his pursuers. He needed to move. He needed to find an exit, a place where he could truly hide, where a lantern's light couldn't reach him, where the men's voices couldn't be heard. But where? The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, an abyss of darkness. The distant sound of the tool, now deeper in the crypt, was a constant reminder that they were there, digging, searching, and that he was the next target. Manuel dragged himself out of his hiding place, his muscles aching and stiff. His eyes, already adapted to the darkness, tried to discern anything that might indicate a path. The slabs beneath his feet were cold and smooth, and he felt the presence of the dead, silent and forgotten, but now, somehow, his only companions. He couldn't stay there. With each passing second, the certainty that he would be found increased. He was a witness to a crime, and in his world, witnesses did not survive. The night was far from over, and for Manuel, every second was an eternity of terror and uncertainty, a cruel game of hide-and-seek with death. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, an abyss of darkness that swallowed the little hope Manuel still harbored. The distant sound of the tool, now deeper in the crypt, was a constant reminder that they were there, digging, searching, and that he was the next target. He could not stay there, frozen by fear. With each passing second, the certainty that he would be found increased, suffocating him more than the heavy air of that place. He was a witness to a crime, and in his world, witnesses did not survive. He moved away from the direction of the men's sounds, choosing to go the opposite way, hoping that the path led back to the entrance, or perhaps to a forgotten exit. The corridor seemed identical in every stretch, a monotonous repetition of stone and darkness, punctuated by empty niches that looked like open mouths, ready to swallow him. The metallic, rusty smell he had noticed before seemed stronger now, almost suffocating. Mingling with the mold and damp earth, it was the smell of time, of decay, and perhaps of something more sinister. Suddenly, his fingers touched a recess in the wall, different from the niches. It was a narrow, almost imperceptible crack, covered by a thin layer of dust and cobwebs, an opening that seemed to have been sealed and then partially undone, perhaps by the passage of time, or by some collapse. Desperation propelled him. It was a chance, however small. He pushed with his shoulder, feeling the stone yield slightly. The crack was tight, barely allowing his aged body to pass. He had to twist, squeeze through, feeling the stone scrape against his clothes and skin, the air thin and claustrophobic. With an agonizing effort, he managed to get through, falling to his knees in a space slightly larger than the corridor. The air here was even denser, heavier, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breath. He was in a chamber, small, circular, with a low ceiling that seemed to press down on him. His hands fumbled on the floor, feeling a thick layer of dust and debris. There were no slabs here, but an irregular surface like beaten earth. He dragged himself to the center of the chamber, trying to stand, but his legs trembled. His eyes swept the surroundings, distinguishing the ghostly shapes of small shelves or niches carved into the walls, all empty. It was a funerary chamber, perhaps, but different from the main corridor. Older, more intimate. A place forgotten even by the dead. The light from the men's lantern would not reach him here. He was safe for now. A sigh of relief escaped his lips, but it was quickly replaced by a new chill. The smell. It was the same metallic, rusty smell, but here it was, overwhelming, almost palpable. And there was something else, a subtle but unmistakable odor that seemed to emanate from the very ground. A smell of copper, or perhaps dried blood, mixed with mold and earth. He fumbled on the floor again, and his fingers touched something hard, cold, and strangely smooth beneath the layer of dust. It was not stone, it was not earth. He began to sweep the dust away with trembling hands, revealing a dark, polished surface. It was not the mosaic of rubies and emeralds he had discovered before, but something different. As more dust was removed, a shape began to emerge. It was a perfect circle, engraved on the floor, and within it, strange symbols, hieroglyphs he had never seen, but which seemed ancient, archaic. And in the center of the circle, something glowed faintly in the almost total darkness. Manuel leaned in, his eyes wide, his heart beating with a new mixture of terror and fascination. It was an object, small, but with an internal luminosity, an opaque glow that seemed to come from within the matter itself. He reached out, hesitant, and touched it. It was cold, smooth, and had an irregular shape, like a rough gem, but much larger than any ruby or emerald he had ever seen. And upon touching it, A subtle vibration ran through his arm, a shiver that was not from cold, but from an unknown energy. Suddenly, a sound, not the distant sound of the tool, but a closer dragging, coming from the crack he had entered, a sound of stone scraping against stone. Someone was trying to force their way through. They had found him, or perhaps they were just exploring, following his trail. Manuel's heart stopped. He was cornered. The chamber, which seemed a refuge, had become a trap, and the object in his hands, a mystery he might never unravel, now seemed a weight, a burden that would condemn him. The night was far from over, and for Manuel, every second was an eternity of terror and uncertainty, a cruel game of hide-and-seek with death, which now knocked at his stone door. The sound. It was not a distant whisper, but a guttural, heavy dragging coming from the crack Manuel had squeezed through. Stone scraping against stone, a noise that seemed to tear splinters not just from the rock, but from his own soul. Manuel's heart stopped, a wild, erratic drum in his aged chest. The chamber, which seconds ago represented relief, now closed in on him. A trap of stone and darkness. They had found him. Or worse, they were so obsessed with scouring every corner that fate had pushed him into their path. He clutched the object in his hands, its opaque glow seeming to intensify slightly, as if the gem itself sensed the imminent danger. It was cold, smooth, and the subtle vibration he had felt before now seemed more pronounced. A faint pulse against his palm. His eyes swept the tiny chamber, desperate for an exit, for a hiding place that didn't exist. The walls were solid, the niches empty, the ceiling low and oppressive. There was nowhere to go. The scraping of stone grew louder, more insistent, a damp sound of mortar giving way, followed by a dry crack. A flickering sliver of light appeared in the crack, a thin line of orange-yellow cutting through the darkness, revealing particles of dust dancing in the heavy air. Manuel recoiled, stumbling, feeling the metallic and moldy smell intensify, now mixed with the acrid odor of human sweat. The voices. "He must be here," hissed the high-pitched voice, muffled but unmistakable. "I felt the trail of fresh air coming from here." "There's nothing but a collapsed wall, you fool," retorted the grave voice with a tone of impatience. "This place is a tomb. The old man wouldn't crawl into a grave." But the crack, it was sealed, and now it's open. Someone came through here, and the smell of copper, it's stronger in here. Manuel crouched, his body trembling uncontrollably. They were inches away. He could hear the men's heavy breathing, the rustle of their clothes, the rustling of something being pushed. The lantern light expanded, a wider beam now, as the stone blocking the crack was pushed aside, revealing an irregular opening, but large enough for a man to pass. The first to appear was the man with the high-pitched voice. His face, illuminated by the lantern he held, was a tangle of scars and a sparse beard. His eyes, small and cruel, swept the chamber, stopping at Manuel, who was huddled on the floor, the object still in his hands. A slow, predatory smile spread across the man's lips. "Well, well, what do we have here? The old rat finally came out of his hole," he sneered, his voice echoing in the chamber. "And what's that you have there, Grandpa? A souvenir from your stroll?" The man with the grave voice, a corpulent giant with broad shoulders and a stony expression, pushed the first man aside, entering the chamber, his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on the object in Manuel's hands. "It's him, boss," said the high-pitched voice, with a glint of triumph. "And he has something." Manuel felt his blood run cold. There was nowhere left to run. Death, which had once been a distant shadow, now materialized before him in flesh and blood, with lanterns and cruel smiles. He clutched the object tighter, feeling the vibration increase, a subtle warmth beginning to emanate from it. His eyes, in a last act of desperation, fell upon the engraved circle on the floor, the archaic symbols he had noticed before. In the center of the circle, there was a shallow depression, almost imperceptible under the dust he had swept away. An insane idea, born of panic and the purest despair, sprouted in his mind. What if— "Hand it over, old man," growled the corpulent man, taking a step forward. "Don't make things harder than they already are. What did you see on the monastery floor? Where's the rest?" Manuel did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the depression in the center of the circle. With a trembling but determined movement, he raised the object. The gem, which had once seemed a burden, now seemed his only chance. The warmth in his hands intensified, and the opaque glow of the object seemed to pulse in sync with his pounding heart. "Don't be a fool!" The corpulent man lunged forward, reaching out to snatch the object from Manuel's hands. But Manuel was faster. With a last gasp of courage, he placed the object in the depression. The instant the gem fit perfectly into place, a low, deep hum filled the chamber. The opaque glow of the object exploded into a greenish and reddish light, illuminating the symbols on the floor, which began to shimmer with an energy of their own. The chamber walls trembled, and a grinding sound, like ancient gears moving after centuries of inactivity, echoed throughout the room. The two men stopped, their faces contorted in a mixture of surprise and fear. The light emanating from the floor was almost blinding, casting dancing and distorted shadows on the walls. The smell of copper and dried blood became overwhelming, and the air crackled with electricity. "What is that?" shouted the high-pitched voice, recoiling. The floor beneath Manuel began to vibrate violently. The symbols in the circle spun, and the light pulsed ever stronger. Suddenly, a section of the wall opposite the crack, which had previously seemed solid and unbreakable, began to move. A secret door, camouflaged in the stone, slowly revealed itself, sliding aside with a groan of stone on stone. Behind it, there was no darkness, but a narrow tunnel, illuminated by a faint, ethereal light, different from the lantern's light. Manuel, still kneeling, looked at the newly opened passage, then at the horrified faces of his pursuers. The gem on the floor continued to glow, holding the door open like a beacon amidst the chaos. It was an exit, a chance. "Get him! Get the object!" shouted the corpulent man, recovering from the shock and lunging forward again. But Manuel was already dragging himself towards the opening, propelled by a force that went beyond fear. He did not know where that tunnel would lead him, but he knew it was away from there, away from the death that awaited him. The hum of the chamber increased, and the light of the gem seemed to pull him inside the tunnel, into the unknown. He cast one last glance back, seeing the men hesitate, torn between pursuing him and trying to understand what had happened. The secret door was opening wider and wider, revealing a path that seemed to lead into the depths of the monastery, or perhaps to a place beyond time. The air in the tunnel was different. Not the heavy mold and metallic smell of the chamber, but a clean, almost ozonic aroma, like that of a recent storm. The greenish and reddish light from the gem on the chamber floor extended to the entrance, but inside the tunnel, the illumination was an ethereal blue-white, soft and constant, seeming to emanate from the polished stone walls themselves. Manuel dragged himself inside, his knees and hands scraping on the smooth surface, feeling the vibration of the gem still resonating in his bones. It was as if the monastery itself, dormant for centuries, was awakening, and he, Manuel, was the unwitting catalyst. He didn't know where he was going, but with every inch he advanced, the feeling of suffocation diminished, replaced by a feverish curiosity. The tunnel was narrow, but tall enough for him to stand, though his back, hunched by age and fear, still kept him in a crouched posture. The walls were not of rough stone, but of a material that seemed like obsidian, dark and reflective, with thin veins of an unknown metal that gleamed with the ethereal light. And throughout its length, symbols, not the archaic hieroglyphs of the circle on the chamber floor, but something more fluid, more organic, like twisted roots or calligraphy of a forgotten language that seemed to writhe and move at the periphery of his vision. A loud, guttural creak echoed behind him. The secret door was closing, not with a sudden bang, but with a deliberate slowness, as if time itself was bending. The light of the gem, which had previously pulled him, now seemed to push him inward into the relative darkness of the tunnel. He heard the muffled shouts of the men, their voices full of fury and frustration. "No, the gem! Get the gem!" The corpulent man's grave voice, full of despair. Manuel did not look back. His only instinct was to move forward, away from that hell. The tunnel began to descend gently in an almost imperceptible spiral. The air grew colder, but not a biting cold, rather a refreshing coolness. The ethereal light intensified, revealing more details on the walls. He noticed that the symbols were not just engravings. They pulsed, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse, but one that seemed synchronized with the beats of his own heart. And the vibration he had felt from the gem now seemed to come from the walls themselves, a low hum that resonated in his ears. He wondered about the gem. What was that object? Why was it there? And why, when placed in that specific spot, had it activated such an ancient and hidden passage? Was it a key, a source of energy, or something more sinister, something he, an old monastery sweeper, could not even conceive? The premise of a monastery built over graves covered by leaves now seemed a facade, a thin layer over a much deeper and more frightening truth. The tunnel suddenly opened into a larger but no less mysterious chamber. It was circular, with a high ceiling that disappeared into the darkness above. And in the center, a well. Not a well of water, but an abyss of absolute darkness, from which emanated an intense cold and a sepulchral silence. The ethereal light of the tunnel did not penetrate the well, but danced on the chamber walls, revealing a series of empty niches, like those in the previous chamber, but much larger, arranged in a ring. And in each niche there was a small, empty platform. Manuel felt a shiver, not from cold, but from a sense of emptiness, of something missing. He approached the well, hesitant, and looked down. There was no bottom. The darkness was so dense it seemed to absorb the light, and the silence was so profound it hurt his ears. But there was something else. A smell. The same smell of copper and dried blood, but here it was more concentrated, more potent, mixed with an odor of damp earth and something he couldn't identify, something ancient and mineral. Suddenly, a sound, not the sound of the men, but a metallic click coming from one of the niches. Manuel turned sharply, his heart pounding. One of the niches, which had seemed empty, now revealed a faint glow. He approached, his steps hesitant, and saw. On the platform, where there had been nothing before, now rested an object. It was a gem, identical to the one he had activated in the previous chamber, but this one was a deep, almost indigo blue, and pulsed with a light of its own, a cold, constant glow. Manuel reached out, his fingers trembling. The gem seemed to call to him, a silent voice in his mind. He picked it up. It was cold to the touch, but the same subtle vibration ran through his arm, stronger this time, like an electric pulse. And as he held it, the blue light intensified, and the symbols on the chamber walls began to glow in response, a lighter, almost electric blue. Then, a sound coming from the tunnel, not the creak of the door, which should have already closed, but a heavy dragging, as if something was being pulled through the passage. The men, they had followed him, or perhaps the door hadn't closed completely, or there was another entrance. Panic returned, chilling his blood. He was in a dead-end chamber, with an abyss of darkness in the center and a new gem in his hands. What should he do? What did that gem mean? And what was coming from that tunnel? The night was far from over, and Manuel, the old sweeper, was now at the heart of a mystery that seemed to transcend time, a cruel game of life or death, where every discovery was a step deeper into the unknown. The vibration of the gem in his hand increased, and the abyss of darkness before him seemed to call him, promising answers or perhaps just more questions. The vibration of the gem in his hand increased, and the abyss of darkness before him seemed to call him, promising answers or perhaps just more questions. But there was no time for philosophical contemplations. The heavy dragging in the tunnel intensified, accompanied by a grunt of effort. They were close, the corpulent man and his accomplice, hungry for what Manuel had discovered or perhaps for what he represented. Panic, which had previously propelled him, now threatened to paralyze him. The chamber was a dead end, with the black abyss as its only dominant feature. Where to go? Where to hide? His eyes fixed on the blue gem in his palm. It pulsed, a cold beacon amidst his despair, and the darkness seemed to deepen, as if the very absence of light was a living entity, waiting. An idea as insane as the first that led him to place the reddish gem sprouted in his exhausted mind. What if the blue gem, cold and pulsating, seemed to fit somehow with the icy vastness of the abyss? There was no niche for it, no visible depression, but there was the void, the silent call of the unknown. The footsteps grew clearer, the sound of boots scraping on the obsidian of the tunnel. Manuel did not hesitate. With a hoarse cry he could barely emit, he raised the blue gem, and with all the strength left in his fragile body, hurled it into the well. The instant the gem left his fingers, a wave of intense cold emanated from the abyss, sweeping the chamber. The blue light that pulsed in the gem transformed into a concentrated beam, a ray of energy that cut through the darkness. The impact of the gem with whatever was at the bottom, or in the absence of a bottom, was not a sound, but a sensation. A deep, resonant echo that vibrated through the floor, the walls, and every bone in Manuel's body. At that very moment, the two men burst from the tunnel. Their eyes, accustomed to the gloom, widened at the scene. Manuel, kneeling at the edge of the well, and the beam of blue light plunging into the darkness, which was now no longer absolute. "What have you done, you wretched old man?" roared the corpulent man, his voice distorted by fury. He lunged forward, hand outstretched, but stopped abruptly. The blue light beam, instead of dissipating, began to expand. It was no longer a beam, but a column of energy rising from the bottom of the well, illuminating the chamber with an ethereal and icy light. And then, the unthinkable. The darkness in the center of the well began to dissipate, not by being illuminated, but as if it were being pushed out, revealing something that had been hidden. There was no bottom, there was no water, there was a staircase. A spiraling staircase made of a translucent, almost crystalline material, reflecting the blue light in 1,000 different ways. It seemed made of ice, but emanated a strange warmth, a warmth that did not burn, but warmed the soul. And the staircase descended in a perfect spiral into the depths that were once only darkness. The symbols on the chamber walls, once mere engravings, now glowed with an electric blue, pulsing in sync with the column of light. The smell of copper and dried blood mingled with a new aroma, clean and mineral, like that of a newly discovered cave. "A staircase?" murmured the high-pitched voice man, his eyes fixed on the marvel unfolding. The fear in his voice was palpable, replaced by an almost childlike curiosity. "Don't just stand there! Get him!" shouted the corpulent man, shaking his accomplice. He tried to advance, but the blue light seemed to create an invisible barrier, a pressure that prevented him from approaching the well. Manuel, still kneeling, felt the energy of the staircase. It was not a threat, but an invitation, a path. The blue gem, which he had thrown, now seemed to be the very essence of that staircase, the force that kept it manifest. He stood up, stumbling, feeling a renewed strength, a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The staircase was not just a path downwards, it was a promise of answers, of a place where perhaps he could finally find peace, or at least a refuge from relentless pursuit. He took a hesitant step towards the staircase. The crystalline material felt solid beneath his feet, but the sensation was like stepping on clouds, light and ethereal. The blue light enveloped him, and the hum that had previously come from the walls now seemed to emanate from the staircase itself, a soft, hypnotic song. "He's going down! Don't let him escape!" The corpulent man, with a roar of frustration, tried to cross the barrier of light again, but was repelled by an invisible force. He fell backward, hitting his head on the stone. Manuel did not look back. With each step he took on the staircase, the chamber above seemed to shrink, and the sound of the men became more distant, muffled by the ethereal melody that now filled his ears. The staircase descended in a gentle spiral, revealing more and more of its crystalline structure, which seemed to extend infinitely into the depths. The air grew denser, but not heavy. It was air charged with energy, with a vitality Manuel hadn't felt since his youth. He felt his tired muscles respond, his mind clear. The blue gem, though invisible in its new form, seemed to infuse him with a strength he didn't know he possessed. He continued descending, the world above becoming a distant memory. The lights of the chamber and the shouts of the men disappeared. Now there was only the blue light of the staircase, the soft song, and the promise of the unknown. Where would this staircase lead him? To the heart of the monastery, to a forgotten realm, or to a place beyond human comprehension? Manuel did not know, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. The journey was far from over, and the old monastery sweeper was now on the threshold of a world no mortal had glimpsed in centuries, guided by a gem and the purest of desperations. With each step on the crystalline staircase, Manuel felt time and space fold. The blue light, which had previously been a beam, now enveloped him completely, an ethereal aura that seemed to purify every cell of his body. The soft hum transformed into a complex melody, a chorus of silent voices that spoke of forgotten ages, of sacrifices and promises. His muscles, once aching and stiff, now responded with an agility he hadn't felt since his youth. His mind, once clouded by age and fear, cleared, allowing him to perceive details that would have previously gone unnoticed. The walls of the abyss, now visible through the light, were not of stone, but of a dark, polished substance, like frozen liquid obsidian. On it, ancient and intricate symbols, identical to those in the chambers above, pulsed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. They were not mere engravings. They seemed to breathe, telling a story without words. Manuel felt a deep connection with that place, as if every fiber of his being was being woven into the tapestry of that mystery. The smell of copper and dried blood had completely disappeared, replaced by an aroma of damp earth and dew, mixed with something reminiscent of incense and myrrh, a perfume of sanctity and antiquity. The staircase continued its spiral descent, and Manuel felt no fatigue. With each turn, the blue light intensified, and the melody grew richer, more enveloping. He realized that the blue gem, which he had thrown into the well, was not lost. It was the very essence of the staircase, the vital force that kept it manifest, pulsing in the heart of each crystalline step. It was as if he were descending through a river of light, guided by an invisible current. Then the staircase suddenly widened. The spiral opened, and Manuel found himself entering a vast chamber, unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was not a dark cave, nor a stone room. It was a space of colossal proportions, illuminated by an indigo blue light that emanated from all directions, without a visible source. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into the gloom, but the walls, which stretched infinitely, were made of a translucent material, like smoked glass, through which he could glimpse shapes and shadows dancing in a silent ballet. In the center of the chamber, where the staircase ended, there was a lake. Not a lake of water, but of liquid light. Of a blue so deep it seemed to absorb the very essence of the night sky. And from the surface of this lake, a structure emerged. It was an altar, but not of stone. It was made of a material that seemed to be a fusion of all the gems he had seen. Rubies and emeralds, sapphires and diamonds, amethysts and topazes, all intertwined in a shimmering mosaic, pulsing with a soft, multicolored light. This was not the monastery's mosaic. This was its heart, its source. Manuel approached the altar, his steps echoing softly in the vastness of the chamber. The melody that had accompanied him on the descent now intensified, and he realized that it emanated from the altar itself, a song of 1,000 voices, of 1,000 souls. As he touched the surface of the altar, he felt an energy course through his body, not the electric vibration of individual gems, but a soft, constant current that filled him with a profound peace. And then he saw. In the center of the altar, floating above the lake of light, there was a single gem. It was transparent, colorless, but radiated all the colors of the spectrum like a perfect prism. And within it, Manuel saw images. Images of his life, of his beloved wife, of his moments of joy and pain. But they were not just his memories. They were the memories of all who had been buried beneath the monastery, the stories of their lives, their loves, their hopes, and their fears. The gem was a repository of souls, a link between the world of the living and the dead, a pulsating heart of all that had been and would be. He understood. The monastery was not just a place of prayer or burial. It was a guardian of memories, of energies, of an ancient knowledge that connected the earth to the cosmos. The gems he had found and activated were keys, not to material treasures, but to truth, to the understanding of the interconnectedness of all existence. The mosaic of rubies and emeralds on the monastery floor was merely the surface, an invitation to those willing to look deeper. Manuel no longer felt the weight of age, nor the pain of loss. He felt part of something greater, a thread in the vast tapestry of life. The pursuit of the men, the poverty, the loneliness, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what he had discovered. He had not fled to a monastery. He had been guided to a destiny. He knew he would not return to the outside world. His place was there, in this sanctuary of light and memory. He would not be a sweeper, but a guardian, a silent guardian of a secret that transcended time, a link between past and future. The colorless gem, the heart of the altar, seemed to invite him, not to merge with it, but to become one with its purpose. With a serene smile, Manuel reached out his hand to the gem. The blue light enveloped him, and the melody of souls welcomed him. He was no longer alone. He was home. The old sweeper's journey had ended, but his true existence, his true peace, was just beginning in the pulsating heart of a mystery humanity had forgotten, but which he, Manuel, had rediscovered.